Hi there, I'm Jarrad Brown, Australian expat financial planner. Thank you for tuning into my video today. Today I want to answer the question for you, should I sell my shares before I repatriate to Australia, i.e. before I jump on the plane from Singapore with the intention to go back and live in Australia again? Now in short, the answer is no. There are an awful lot of myths floating around when it comes to what you do or what you should and should not do with your shares when you go back. So hopefully in this video we can unpack some of those myths, give you some clarity on exactly what you need to know, as well as what your options look like. So let's dive straight in. Now, first and foremost, if we look at the shares, the ETFs, the managed funds that you bought or been awarded as part of your remuneration in Singapore, whilst you have lived in Singapore, i.e. you might have bought the shares on the stock exchange, you might have been awarded them by your employer after the date that you arrived in Singapore, then when you return to Australia with the intent to live in Australia, you will go through what is called a deemed acquisition, which means that you don't need to log in and sell those shares or buy them or change them or really do anything. When you go back to Australia, you will be deemed to have bought those shares again. So if you bought those shares in Singapore for $1, you flew back to Australia with the intent of living there at $2, and then you sold them in Australia at $3, you're going to be deemed to have bought them at the $2, and you will have sold them at the $3, and that will be what your tax is calculated on. So you didn't need to do anything with the shares, you didn't need to sell them, buy them. That is exactly what happens. Now, how would that have been different if we'd sold the shares before we went back and then bought them again once we're back in Australia? It wouldn't. We would have just had that additional admin of having to make that transaction happen, and we would have paid some brokerage for the privilege. So ignore any advice when it comes to selling and buying back again, because that is complete nonsense. Now, on the shares or ETFs or managed funds that you might have owned before you came to Singapore, i.e. whilst you were in Australia, then we need to look back at whether you did a deemed disposal when you left Australia, i.e. did you pay tax on those shares or funds when you left as if you'd sold those shares, because that will impact what you should do with them when you plan to go back to Australia. Now, we're not going to get into deemed disposal in this video, that we already published plenty of content on the topic, so we'll drop a link in the show notes on this one so that you can check that out. But just bear in mind that on any shares that you may have owned before you got to Singapore, just be very mindful of what impact that has on what you should do before you go back, because that may just change things from a tax perspective. Now, back to the shares and funds that you've bought or owned or been awarded while you're in Singapore. The other option that you have before you go back is to look at changing the ownership structure. That is, what name or what structure do you actually own the shares in? For example, if they're currently in your name, you might consider transferring them to your husband or wife. You might consider transferring them to a joint account, to your superannuation fund, to an insurance bond, to a family trust, to some other holding structure that creates some future tax benefits for you. Now here you need to do your homework, check out the fees, check out the running costs, check out what the savings are going to mean from a tax perspective. Australia is a very high tax jurisdiction, so naturally we want to be doing everything we can to minimize that future tax exposure, but not if the fees are going to outweigh those future benefits. So do your homework here. Don't get faced with any nasty tax consequences or surprises when you go back, and don't fall for some of this common advice around selling and buying things back because it's somehow going to trick the tax authorities. Make sure you do your homework and make fully informed decisions. I hope that's been helpful. I hope that shed a bit of light on what a deemed acquisition means, what happens when you go back to Australia with your shares, and gives you a bit of food for thought. Thank you for tuning in. Please do like, subscribe to the channel, and I look forward to seeing you next time.